I'm Father Jim Fitz. I work at the University of Dayton. My official title there is Vice President for Mission and Rector. Our office works very hard at helping to educate faculty, staff, and students about our Marianist charism, the characteristics of a Marianist university. I've been in that position since 2010.
This year is a big one for Father Jim Fitz. After celebrating his 50th ordination anniversary last year, 2025 marks his 60th anniversary of first vows with the Society of Mary. And at the end of this year, he's stepping down from his long-standing role as Vice President for Mission and Rector at the University of Dayton. In our 50th episode of Sharing Our Marianist Stories, we'll dive into Father Jim's deep connection to UD and explore his journey as a Marianist. Why don't we start with your first encounter of the Marianists?
Well, let me say that my story started before I was born. My father went to the University of Dayton in the 1930s during the Depression. He got a football scholarship to UD, and that's the only reason he could come. And at one point, since he was missing the Friday practice, the head football coach said, either you have to give up chemical engineering or you have to lose your scholarship. He wanted to stay in chemical engineering, but his family had no resources during the Depression. His dad was a carpenter. So he went to see Brother Walhaven, and he said to Brother Walhaven, I hate to do this, but I'm going to have to drop chemical engineering because I can't be at football practice and lab on Friday. And so Brother Walhaven said to him, no, you'll come and do your lab on Sunday. I want you to stay in chemical engineering. And my dad always remembered that. Fast forward, my brother Ray, who's 5 years older than I am, is a Marianist. He was looking at a vocation at the end of high school, and my dad said, well, I always liked the Marianists. Why don't you at least contact them? And he did, and that's where he ended up. And so that's my first encounter with the Marianists is when my brother Ray was in the order, and he was a scholastic here on the Mount St. John property, and we would come down and visit, and I got to know the Marianists and was very impressed by two things at that time, the community feel of the brothers, and many of them seemed to be very happy in what they were doing. So that was my first encounter with the Marianists.
You mentioned that really early influence of the Marianists with your dad, and you mentioned that your biological brother is right. A Marianist. Yeah. I'm curious if there were ways that Marianist spirit may have influenced your family or your upbringing overall.
I would say it's more the Catholic influence. My parents were very faithful Catholics, and we were all raised that way. We did say the rosary like during Lent on Friday nights. That would be before we have meal. And there was a strong spirituality, a strong support for involvement in the church. I would say that's what nurtured the vocation, was that strong Catholic background. And I think that led to when I joined the Marianists. I would say my dad was very strong on being a person of integrity. My mom was a person who very much cared about other people and was very compassionate. And so one of the things I think that happened that I could later identify as Marianist is we learned the faith more by having it caught than taught. And I think my parents helped me and my brothers and sister to catch the faith.
What led to that first inkling of your calling to be a Marianist brother?
I had thought about priesthood. In those days, going to a Catholic school, both grade school and high school, that was talked about a great deal. So I had thought about it. And at that point, I was interested in math. And so I thought teaching math in high school for the rest of my life would be a good thing. And the Marianist order was an opportunity to do that, to work with young people in education. The thing about the Marianists was their sense of community care, but also they had a prayer life, and that would have blended with what I grew up with.
Were there other orders you had looked into?
I never did. My brother Ray looked into some other orders, but once I had met the Marianists, I thought, if I'm going to join an order, why would I join another one? My pastor wanted me to become a diocesan priest, and at that time, your pastor had to sign off if you were going to join any religious order or seminary. And he wouldn't sign the letter to the Marianists unless I went and spent a weekend at the seminary in Cleveland. I lived in Akron, Ohio. So I went up and spent a weekend, but that convinced me that the Marianists were where I wanted to be.
Take me through a little bit of that process of entering into the formation process with the brothers?
At that time in the church, you would go to the religious life right after high school. The high school I went to was in Akron, Ohio, and it was not run by the Marianists at that time, although it's become a Marianist school since then. So I went, and I was the only one from my school to go, and there were lots of Marianists from two high schools in Cleveland, St. Joe's and Cathedral Latin. But I felt like an outsider. I needed to work into building relationships. And in the novitiate in those days, there was a lot of silence, so building relationships took a lot longer. So I joined the formation. You did some discernment about where you wanted to go, and I had talked about being a math teacher. But the novice director at the time, Father Matthews, asked me to consider priesthood, so I did, and eventually made the discernment that that's the way I would go. The novitiate formation was the same for everybody. There was no distinction between those who were thinking about priesthood or those who wanted to continue as religious brothers. Where that made a difference is when you started your college education. So when I came to UD, the major for anyone going on to be a priest was philosophy. So that changed the way I would end up going in terms of that. I was thinking maybe I could major both in philosophy and math, but at that time it just doesn't seem realistic. So I was asked to choose something else in the school, College of Arts and Science. So I took history as a minor, and that'll have played itself later on in my life.
Father Jim earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Dayton in 1968. 3 years after he professed first vows with the Society of Mary, and right as the Church was implementing changes as a result of the Second Vatican Council. The 60 years that followed included numerous ministerial roles such as teaching, campus ministry, adult religious education, and serving on 2 provincial councils, the first for the Cincinnati province and the second for the province of the United States. He's held roles across the country, from high schools in Kalamazoo, Michigan, to St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas, and the University of Dayton in Dayton, Ohio, where he has served as Vice President for Mission and Rector for the past 15 years. I'd be really curious for your insights on your experience of the unification of the provinces, especially given that you had so many years on the provincial council for the Cincinnati province, and then came back to the provincial council as assistant provincial after the unification.
2 things I think that happened during that time. There was an opposition from some brothers about bringing the provinces together. They wanted to keep the separate provinces, but it made a lot of sense to bring the provinces together. So the first couple of years was just trying to hear people, what their concerns were, and try to answer those concerns. So we worked through that. Another thing that happened, and when we started the new province in 2002, was the sexual abuse scandal. We had to spend time working on how we were going to respond to all that. And then just organizing a new province. So you had 4 provinces, and each had a different policy about how money was used. So some provinces, most of it went to the provincial administration, and then they sent money back to the communities. Some, they kept it in the communities and sent the money. So we had to come up with a unified system. And so we worked all those 8 years to work that through. From the time we began to the time we finished the 8 years, there was a more sense of this is one province. There were still people who were not happy. But I would say today, most people are really happy with the fact that we have joined provinces. And there are things that we're able to do that we weren't able to do before. I'll use an example. We now have an association of Marianist universities. The 3 Marianist universities work together to form faculty and staff and to do joint programs. As an example, the provosts from each of the university meet regularly to talk about how they can do their work and how they can incorporate our Marianist and Catholic charism. We have a sponsorship of our schools. There was an organization in the former Cincinnati province that brought all those high schools together. Now we have a national organization of sponsorship that brings all the schools together, and I think it's really been enriching for that. And I think one of the other things that we really had to work with is how do we develop our laity in the schools? And so we developed programs to really take seriously the fact that lay people can really work with the charism, live the charism, imbue it in a school. And so I think that's one of the things that we contributed to over those 8 years, the growth of empowering the laity who worked in our institutions. Those are some of the things that happened in those years as bringing the province together.
one of your first ministries was on the diocesan level. I'm curious if that was more common then, and also how did that impact you as a brother?
Well, it wasn't as common. In fact, one of the few places where we did that was in the Diocese of Kalamazoo, because the bishop really wanted to do the education. And so we had another brother, for example, who worked in an office helping to coordinate parish pastoral councils. He just felt that we're talking about laity and the changes of Vatican II, that if we're going to do this, we're going to have to educate a whole group of lay people to be involved. So I think it was not very common to do that, but we did have a couple people who did that work. In the Diocese of Kalamazoo, that was a big push of the bishop there, and he asked the Marianists to step up to that, and so that's how it happened. We first went to Kalamazoo to work in the school, but being a small diocese, I think also helped because he got to know us, so there was a sense of collaboration that might not be in a huge diocese.
You mentioned a number of roles in leadership, and I'm curious how the charism may have impacted your own perspective on leadership and the ways that you enact leadership.
Administration is necessary for any kind of organization to move forward. In fact, Paul talks about it as one of the gifts of the Spirit. I'll just talk about the transition from campus ministry at the university to the Marianist province of the United States. One of the things about that is if they have asked me, where would you prefer to do, I would have stayed at the university in campus ministry. But I also knew that to bring these four provinces together was going to take some gifts. And at that time, our first provincial was Brother Steve Glodek, who I think as an idea person, his personality is very different than mine. Mine's an administrative kind of, I'm a sensate. So how do you organize? Here's where we want to go. Okay, here's how we can organize and work that. So it came out of the sense that this is going to be important to do this well. If you look at what Jesus said in the gospel about service, I came to serve and not be served. Or when the disciples were upset with the mother of James and John asking for them to have the first places in the kingdom, he said, the most important people in the kingdom will be the servants of others. And so I've just sensed that as being what my gift can be. And I would say there's certain scripture passages that hit that strongly. Jesus said at one point, the gift you have received, give as gift. And I have to say my life has been very gifted, and therefore, how can I not say I could do this? Now, if they'd have asked me to teach music in a high school, I would have probably said, you're asking the wrong person. But I couldn't say that I couldn't do the thing. And the other thing is, when you talk about our Marian spirituality, obviously she says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. So when you do a discernment, what is God calling me to? What is Jesus saying I should do? Mary's question is one that's important. The other thing that I find really important about that is our Marianist spirituality helps in terms of being a good administrator. One of the things I can say is my whole life has been blessed. I couldn't ask for a better family. And the more I work with students who have difficult family life, the more I realize how much that was a gift. So for me, one of the strongest things about the Marianist spirituality is Mary's Magnificat. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior, because he has done great things for me. I have been blessed by God. To me, Marianist spirituality about thankfulness is really important. One of the things about working on the provincial council in both the province of Cincinnati and the province of the United States was visiting Africa and visiting Nairobi. Just changed my perspective on how blessed I am. I don't know if I would be as dedicated to a simple life and working with the poor if I hadn't been there concretely and walked where people don't have any kind of plumbing, don't have any kind of clean water. When I worked with the Marianist province of the United States, I started visiting India, and the students who are in our program for training, this is their opportunity to get out of that situation. And therefore, to go visit is very important. At the end of our 8-year term of office, we had several regions. One of them was the region of Eastern Africa. At that time, it was not a region yet. But one of the last things we did is we helped them become independent as a region. The same with Korea. We helped Korea become independent as a region because they're going to have to do the same thing we did in the United States. We had 4 Marianist religious who came here, and there were good things that happened, but there were real struggles. And we will continue to support them. For example, in India and Africa, we still raise money for all those ministries that they're doing. Just past May, the region of India became independent. And I think it was saying our role as an administration is to train people that could do that there. They understand the culture better than we do. And they have gifts, and you have to empower them. I think it's really important that we empower people.
You mentioned some really key concepts in there. You mentioned the call to something that might be a little uncomfortable, but also the self-awareness to know, is this call something I would be good at versus not? And how that then allows you to have that role of serving and empowering.
One of the things that we talk about in terms of what is the mission of the Society of Mary is to bring Christ to the world. And so everything that I've done has had that opportunity to bring Christ to the world. When I was in the scholastic age, early in my religious life, there was a musical called Man of La Mancha that came out. And there's a song, To Dream the Impossible Dream. And that's one of the things that gives me hope. I think the Christian vision, some people would say it's the impossible dream, but I would say, okay, but it's the dream that I think we need for our world. And so how do we make sure that that comes alive? And some people say, well, you're not successful. Not all the students graduate from UD or have bought into that. And I said, well, success is not the judgment. The judgment is, have we done the best we can to share the vision of Jesus Christ, to bring it to the world, and not only in word, but in deed. The Marianist charism is caught, not taught. And someone says to me, well, we're not successful with all of our students. I said, well, Jesus wasn't all that successful with his first disciples. One betrayed him, one denied him. Now, did he give up on them? No. So are we doing as best we can to present the gospel message in the word and deed, and let the grace of God to work? And sometimes it works way beyond whatever you expect. The other thing I think is really important to me is anything we do as a Marianist religious is to be compassionate. Jesus called us to compassion. And I always think of Mary standing at the cross as the greatest sign of compassion that can ever be. Compassion comes from a Latin word meaning to suffer, passio cum, with, to stand with. And there she was, standing with her son. And sometimes that's all we can do in our ministry, pastoral ministry, is people are struggling. The only thing we might be able to do is really stand with them. But I really think that's an important part of any ministry we do. And so even now, as an administrator at the university, can I stand with those who are suffering? If someone is struggling, can I be there just to be with them, to know that there are people who will walk with them? To me, that's one of the great gifts of our Marianist spirituality, is watching Mary as the first disciple, how she empowered and used compassion. And it also happened in Cana. She's the one that noticed that the couple was in trouble, needed wine, and she went to Jesus at that point. And sometimes I think she said, okay, I can't do anything about this, but I presented it to Jesus. And sometimes that's the best we can do.
You mentioned that song from Man of La Mancha. It made me curious what you might see as the dream in our current context for the Marianist family.
Well, I think it's bringing the gospel to the world as it is. So right now, our culture is pretty contemptuous. If you listen to the rhetoric, just of the shift in politics. But how can we concretely respond to that? I can't change it, but I can give people hope. And I can learn how to challenge that by the way I act. One of my favorite Old Testament authors is Walter Brueggemann, and he talks about the role of the prophet as a challenge in justice. But he also says the best prophets give us a vision of how it could be different. And so I think I can give a vision of how it can be different. But instead of being contemptuous about somebody, how do we try to understand somebody? I just finished reading Questioning God by Timothy Radcliffe and a fellow Dominican from Poland. And one of the things they do is they say, how do you deal with people? The first thing we could do is ask a question. Why do you think that way? Or can you tell me what's going on in your life? Rather than making judgments and making comments about people. So one of the things we can do is to give examples of how we build community, how we build relationships, and how we counteract the kind of contemptuous atmosphere that we're in, not letting that take over. There's a line in that song about the world would be better for this if one person, one man, scorned and covered with scars, still strove with his last ounce of courage to reach the unreachable star. Will we ever have a kingdom of God here on earth? Totally, probably not. But any step we can take towards that is worth my energy and worth my time. That's why the song kind of resonates with me. I don't expect all the world's problems to be solved when I die, but have I made any contribution to individuals, to a community, to others that dream can come true? And I think that's the best thing about the Marianist family. One of the things I hope for the Marianist family, especially as the lay family grows, is that we can be a source of dialogue, of reconciliation and peace. And if we can do that, that would be one of the greatest gifts to our world right now.
You're in a unique spot that you have your biological brother, Ray, 5 years older than you, who became a Marianist. So I'm curious if you could shed a little bit of light on what that experience has been like to share that with Brother Ray.
One piece of background is my brother Ray was president of the University of Dayton for 23 years, so he knows what it's like to be an administrator at a university. I can talk to him about something I'm dealing with and get some good advice. I think the other thing, though, is it feels good that we can just share things about the family and how we might be helpful to the family. When I was director of campus ministry at UD, he was president, so I had to report to him. And then when I became provincial, he had to report to me because the president of the university reported to the provincial. But it's always been a very positive relationship. And it doesn't mean we agree everything, but it's taught me how to dialogue and talk about a difficult issue with someone and working together to try to come to a solution. We have a bond from our family. Our family is still very close. My one brother in California, but he'll come and visit and spend time with everybody in the Cincinnati, Dayton area. It's been a positive experience. And I know that sometimes families have differences, but I talked earlier about thankfulness, Mary's Magnificat. I have to say my family relationships have been always very positive. We don't all agree, but in terms of supporting one another, being with one another, I could ask for more positive experience.
Before we hear Father Jim's response to our concluding question, I offer a word of thanks for listening to this episode of Sharing Our Marianist Stories, a production of the North American Center for Marianist Studies in Dayton, Ohio. I'm Mike Bennett, Media Administrator for NACMS. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, follow us on social media at This Is NACMS, and utilize the resources on our website at www.nacms.org. And now, let's hear Father Jim's response to our concluding question. We know the Marianist founders corresponded through letter writing. And so if you were going to write a letter to anyone, dead or alive, and be guaranteed a response, who would you write to and what would be the topic?
The first thing that comes to me is Jesus Christ. The reason I say that is oftentimes when you set up a credit card account, they say you have to ask this question, who would you like to meet in history? And I'll put down Jesus Christ. But the thing about it would be twofold. How do we live that dream, the vision of the reign of God here and now? Is there anything that I'm missing or we're missing? And the other would be, I have found his words to be very supportive of my life, and I would want to be able to say that. I think my life is different because I made commitment to those words and to his life. There's so many things he does in the gospel stories that just challenge me to be better. So, for example, at the cross, I asked myself, what would I say? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Or could I come to that? I've never been in that kind of situation, but it has challenged me to be more forgiving and reconciling. His words and actions have made my life different and continue to make it different.